I want to start back on the I, the perceptual relativism, which is something we started talking about a bit in the last class. It's on page 15, that people from different cultural backgrounds perceive reality in different ways since they process the same data of experience in terms of alternative frameworks of belief or representational schemata. And so I've actually stolen the middle part of that sentence, which is how Ingold was saying, if we remember from the last class, that actually the claims of natural science and the claims of anthropology are not incompatible, because anthropologists are leaving the real out there, the natural out there, to be studied by the scientists. And we're saying that if people perceive reality differently, it's because it's been cut up differently in our minds. And even Franz Boas talked about the perceiving eye and how this could be influenced by our culture and environment in which we were brought up. So again, a very succinct statement from Ingold on perceptual relativism. And one of the things that I believe is most difficult about reading Ingold is that oftentimes he is arguing against the kinds of things that we want to believe because they're so foundational to our introduction to anthropology and what we might call anthropological thought in general, or what we take it to be. In the sense that there's a connection between the perceptual relativism and what we conceive as cultural relativism, because if people perceive things differently in terms of how they were taught or how to believe, who are we to say, or at least who are we to make a judgment about those kinds of perceptions? And what Ingold is saying is that it is also linked to the idea of linguistic relativism, or what on page 21 he calls the standard semiological approach to linguistic significations. And so what this means is that we are here talking about how people apprehend the world. And the idea in much of anthropology is that as we are perceiving the stuff out there, that we are seeing the things that our culture helps us to see. And so we see elephants or bears as in the landscape, encoded on the landscape, in the same way or similarly to what Ferdinand de Saussure called the conceptual representations encoded in medium of sound. The great Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure is also on page 21, who laid the foundation for this approach, argued that a sign is essentially the union of two things, a signifier and a signified, and that the relationship between them is established through the mapping of one system of differences on the plane of ideas onto another system of differences on the plane of physical substances. And I want to pause here for a little bit, because this really is hugely important to how linguistics and people think about language. But again, it underwrites or it underlies a lot of the anthropological thinking about perceptual relativism, and then in turn, the idea of cultural relativism. So I wanted to pause on the great, what does Ingold call him? The great Swiss linguist, Ferdinand de Saussure. And I found this little diagram from a post about semiotic theory on Medium, which I think helps us out maybe. So what I think Saussure is famously arguing is that you have the signified out there in the world. That's that actual cat, although it's so, by now we're like 17 steps removed from the cats. But imagine if you have a cat. Does anyone have a cat here? Yeah, okay. And then you have the signifier, that word that helps me understand what it is you're talking about. And there's that diagram, which is actually on the book, The Course in General Linguistics, which is his most famous book, where you have, somebody thinking something, saying a word, it's getting processed by the other person, going back into their ear and their brain. But the essential idea is that our signifiers are mostly arbitrary, almost always arbitrary, in the sense that there's nothing about a cat. Where did we get that word? Cat. It doesn't, doesn't sound like that. It doesn't paw like that. It doesn't say anything about the fur or whatever cats have. So we just agree arbitrarily that the word cat should stand for that animal. And there's no, we could use different words. We just have to agree upon them. And so this, it's a pretty amazing idea that our signs or symbols don't really have any necessary connection to the reality out there. I just also wanted to note that this book of Ferdinand de Saussure, he never wrote it. He apparently was an amazing professor, and so he'd give lectures back in the day, over 100 years ago. And this book was written by his students who were taking notes, and they eventually compiled it into a book. So he must have been good. Where's Ferdinand? There he is, the great Swiss linguist, Saussure. And I want to, again, dwell upon this a little bit because I do some of this in intro and in the cultural anthropology class that we just took, because it is a pretty profound revelation, the idea that the signifiers, the sounds, are arbitrary, and therefore, in some ways, we are able to do these symbolic things with language that are impossible for non-human animals. My own experience with Saussure was through reading this book titled Ferdinand de Saussure by Jonathan Culler. I read this in college, and this book was perhaps, for me, pretty mind-blowing. And if I think about what I think Culler was trying to say, or at least what I got out of it, is that there's another step that happens here, and it's a strange step. But if we divorce the relationship between the signifier and the signified, and that's easy enough to understand that that's an arbitrary relationship. Dogs aren't called dogs because of the way they bark. Sugar isn't called sugar because it tastes sweet. But there's a next step to that in some ways the way we cut up the world with these signifiers, the way the signifieds get signified, could also be arbitrary. That there's nothing inherent that we have to name everything, and that in different societies, we might decide to name on whole different groups of naming. And so in intro, and I don't know if we went all through this in cultural, we may have gone through some of it. We can see this in various ways, such as, if you remember, perhaps you have read Laura Bohannon's famous article, Shakespeare in the Bush, in which she starts out trying to translate Hamlet, and she runs straight up against the problem that there is no concept of ghost in the language that she's translating into. And it's not simply that, it's not simply that they don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe in ghosts either, but I have a concept of what a ghost might be. Whereas what she was arguing was, in that society, they had beliefs about death, but they didn't believe any individual personality would survive death. And so there was no such thing there is no concept, no conceptualization of a ghost. So you could have an absence of signifieds. You could have signifieds in one place, and in other languages, they simply aren't there. You can also have a profusion of signifieds. And I think we did look at perhaps a video about this, how Russian speakers, for example, divide up the color spectrum so that light blue and dark blue are different individual words. And if you test Russians as the spectrum of blue goes across, something happens in their brains and they're better able to pick this out because their encoding for it is different than our own. So you could have more signifieds. There's a whole debate about Eskimo words for snow, which may or, that's been a long whole other thing. That's the other example that is often used of how, you can have all these kind of different individual words to describe something, which makes people more perceptive to those ideas. And then I know we did this in cultural anthropology because it's so cool, which is that, the distinction between stream and river in standard American English versus fleuve and rivière in French, which is often translated across to mean water of, small flowing water and big flowing water, you might say. Whereas what we think the French mean, or at least Marshall Solon's famous anthropologists think the French mean, is that there's a distinction in French between those waters that flow into the sea and those that are tributaries, which is something we never even think about in English. We don't go down to a stream and ask ourselves if this thing is flowing into the sea or not. It doesn't matter to us. And so this book was called waiting for, now I'm blanking out. The very famous play, of course, called Waiting for Godot. Oh, it was called Waiting for Foucault still, which of course is that French philosopher person. So, he's trying to be, it was a collection of humorous essays, funny stuff by Solons, but it does, I think this example may have been used in Jonathan Culler's work, which is, about these, in some ways, if we take the mental leap of the signifier being arbitrary, it also gives us the insight that the very signified, the way that we order the world, the way that we perceive the world might be very different in different societies. So again, this is an enormous and sort of mental head game. It gets us into places that we become, I guess it gets very heady very fast, I would say, right? And one wonders how you do translation then between people who are encased in their own perceptual worldviews. It makes it much more difficult. Now, these have been the giants of anthropology and linguistics, and to take a different approach, Ingold begins by talking about, here on page 20, about his father. And I finally looked up who Ingold's father was, Cecil Terence Ingold, who lived a very long life. There you go. And turns out he was a mycologist. So he's introducing little Ingold to the fungi. And in fact, he has a whole group of fungi that were named after him, the Ingoldian fungi. So they're starting to be renamed now that we're getting all DNA stuff in there. But there they are, going around and he's introducing and tasting and touching. So you have on the one hand this very British, the president of the British Mycological Society over here, and he compares that with the Walbiri of Central Australia. This book by Mervyn Meggitt, who describes how a boy being prepared for initiation and goes on this grand tour. And what's kind of incredible about this is here you have people that are, one might say, on the opposite ends of the earth, the opposite ends of the educational establishment. But for Ingold, he finds that the principle is exactly or just the same in terms of how people are shown things and asked to see them for themselves. And so he asks here on page 21, if all knowledge is cradled within the mind, why should so much importance be placed on ensuring that novices should see or otherwise experience for themselves the objects or features of the physical world? So again, if it's simply a mental game, if we just have to learn the mental categories of the French or the Walbiri or the Mycological Society, if we just have to read their papers or do their mind stuff, if that is transmitted in mind, why do we need to start tasting and seeing and experiencing that for ourselves? So this causes Ingold to then go into a reconsideration of this whole idea of linguistic relativism, which we're going to be doing at various points in the course, but this is an initial tackle of it, which is to say that which is to question the idea that the sounds we produce are simply arbitrary carriers of some other meaning and separate from the feelings and the expression in which we produce. And so what he draws here on some on a phenomenologist, I believe it's drawing a Merleau-Ponty here. When you yell in anger, the yell is your anger. It is not a vehicle that carries your anger. So when you are feeling something, when you are in a state of emotion, the yell is itself something. It's not sort of, as he put it, it's not that they're trying to, the sound is not broken off from your mental state and dispatched like a message in a bottle, cast upon the ocean of sound in the hope that someone might pick it up. This yell is the reverberation of your own being. The yell. And so what Ingold is saying is that when we speak and when we're doing our speeching stuff, it's one of the ways that humans pour themselves into the world. And just like Leos Janáček on page 23, a famous, perhaps the most famous Czech composer, was trying to notate the waves and the chickens. And so for what Ingold is trying to tell us here is that when we speak, we are trying to put ourselves, our feelings into the world, just like those chickens are clucking on, and the waves are crashing, and it's part of, it's not broken off from this feeling of life. There's Janáček looking kind of crazy there at the end of his life. Ever since reading Ingold on Janáček, every time I get to hear some of him, I get all excited, but there he is. And in the same way, revisiting the Cree hunting tales, that these are an expression. They're not trying to necessarily tell exactly what happened when they talk about the animals, looking at them, giving themselves up, but it's a way of doing song poetry, pouring yourself into the world. And the role of music here is perhaps really interesting and important. And Ingold mentions the work of Suzanne Langer, Philosophy in a New Key, perhaps her most famous work. I was looking her up. One of the first women to have an academic career in philosophy in the United States. Philosophy is a strange discipline. It's very heady over there. Tends to be a little bit. There hasn't been a lot of breakthrough on these kinds of things. But it reminds me, well, Gabe, you were interested in these sections. What's the art and the music stuff going on there?
Say it. Well, like Ingold kind of touched upon like the working definition of art, because in our history we learned that art is in experience. Like that is the lowest thing that you could water art down to, an experience. It's like it's a communicative thing. You use art to communicate with other people. And then Ingold.
Well, let's back up a little bit. So, I mean, I guess let's start with what we expect. Let's say I'm going down into the Jaeger Museum and I'm looking at that new exhibit with those Baroque paintings, or then compared to Andy Warhol. I think that's what's going up pretty soon if it's not already there. What am I expecting art to do for me when I walk in there?
You're expecting it to communicate something to you.
I'm expecting it to communicate something to me, kind of like that person with the head over here and the ear and going in, and if I can just get the message, right? So we expect art to represent something, right? We often expect it to be a representation of something else. And so I'm going to walk up to that Baroque painting or whatever it is. I haven't seen this yet. I'm just making this up. And I'm going to look at the label, and then I'm going to look at the person or the house, and I'm going to say, oh, looks pretty good. I don't know. I'm a terrible person when it comes to art, but that's, I'm expecting to have some sort of communication or some sort of message. And Langer, in some ways, wants to get away from it by turning to music, because what happens with music?
Music is like the least representational thing.
It's hard to say what you're right. It's like, it is what it is, right? It's the least representational in the Western tradition. And I think she's trying to say that about art in general, that while we expect art to represent something, what art should be or could be, or these performances are, is on page 25, which I think you might have quoted, is to give form to human feeling. And so in this sense, art is a way of, again, pouring ourselves out into the world. It doesn't necessarily have to be realistic or represent something as much as it causes a feeling. It is our expression of feeling. And that's what I think that Langer apparently was after in her book, and she was after this idea of aesthetics and feeling and how to approach that, to do philosophy in a new key. The keys, yes, the keys, which brings us to our next question, which is about learning and the keys and apprehension. Willa, keys. How should we learn about keys, or what are we supposed to think about keys and learning and how to am I supposed to go in and decipher that art like I just wanted to?
We talked about it. It was less like decoding things and more like, you know how like they describe like, you know, the liberal arts college things is teaching you how to critically think as opposed to like teaching you what you're actually learning kind of thing.
Ah,
That's how I was kind of thinking the way you're saying, like you see the big picture, you learn how to do things. It's less like it's just a list of facts that you're like, because that only tells you the facts and those are just in your mind. But if you learn how to perceive things and like the clues, pick up clues, then you can continue learning. It's more like retention. I can't do it. Yeah.
oh, I like that a lot. So in some ways, what we're trying to do here is like the liberal arts. There's that art. Yeah, to sort of instill that love of lifetime learning so that you can generate those experiences for yourselves, not simply giving you a bunch of information on a PowerPoint. Let me get both those things up. So yes, the key is not to decode things. It's not a cipher, but it's a clue so that you can go out there and discover it for yourself. You go to the exhibit yourself, and that if I can do anything, which I'm not sure that I can, is to try and draw your attention to certain elements in the world and to sort of point them out and highlight them. But I can't just fill up your minds with information. That's not a good idea, even if it could be done. And so it has to do with the idea of revelation. Although I think differently than at least I think about revelation when I sometimes think, I don't know if you think about it this way, or if it's my own language ideas. When I think about a revelation, I think about something hitting me out of the blue, like I've just had a revelation. Whereas if you look at, and maybe it's because of reading the book of Revelations, I mean, the book of Revelations is about revealing or showing, in this case, I guess in the book of Revelations, what was going to happen. It is being revealed, it is being gradually revealed, it is being lived. I think, well, you mentioned the Bible here. I think you're absolutely right. These ancient texts speak to us because, not because they're full of precepts, but they're because they show us, or they are working through of helping us to have that experience with having to have us experience that in the world with guides. And so what Ingold ends up with here is this fabulous point that there's what he calls a poetics of dwelling. So again, poetry, probably why I've never been able to figure poetry out, because it's a way of, it's not prose, it's pouring your feeling into the world, right? A poetics of dwelling, which unites the Cree tales of animals offering themselves to humans. So going back to those hunters and the encounter and the love that they feel, the offering up. So the Cree hunter is trying to pour into the world this feeling. With the Aboriginal Australian stories of ancestors emerging from water holes, with Yanacheks, I think I'm finally kind of maybe pronouncing that okay. Yanacheks attempts to notate the sounds of nature, and Ingold's father's efforts to introduce me to the plants and fungi of the countryside. So you take these four different, really different places and really different peoples, but you have this unity here about learning and about experience and about feeling the world in a very different way than perhaps we've been taught in at least certain parts of our educational system. Hopefully we can retain that liberal arts thing Will is talking about, of how to learn all this feeling stuff. And so it ends up being against the idea simply of perceptual relativism, that there's that there's sort of, you know, just our cultural schema that process in the world, because if that's all that mattered, then we wouldn't need to go out in the world and experience and taste and feel and touch this stuff. So it's, you know, it's not trying to get away from the idea of doing abstract reason and science and all that thing, but to really stress the idea of feeling and intuition, so that we might do even better science, more fully engaged science and activity in the world. And I think this is a really profound observation and just a way of thinking about life and how we learn and live, that perhaps grounds us in a way of learning and perceiving the world, that can help us confront some of the things that we need to confront in life.